Every who down in Who Newville liked the holidays a ton, but where to get great prices on gifts they had no idea. None. They searched and they searched for great gifts under $25. Gifts for spouses and friends and even their toddlers. When suddenly one who shouted, Walmart has what you want, knowing they have Lego, Tree Hut, and no prices to flaunt. So they enjoy the holiday season as Who's often do, cheering and shouting, Walmart has incredible gifts. Who knew? Find gifts they'll love under $25 at Walmart.
Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Like Moscow X, I really try to set the book in the present-day context of the spy war between the West and Russia. But I think at a deeper level, it's also a story about really a group of friends and different kinds of friendship and what it means to really be able to know the people around you, or frankly, what we oftentimes can't know about the people around us.
Welcome to the Spy Masters podcast. I'm your host, Antonia Senior. I'm a writer and journalist, and it's my mission to bring you all the best spy writing, fact and fiction, historic and contemporary. This time, my guest is the best-selling breakout star of spy thrillers, David McCloskey. David is a former CIA analyst turned writer and podcast host, and he uses his inside knowledge of the CIA to write brilliant thrillers which feel utterly authentic. We're talking today about The Seventh Floor, his third novel. There's a Russian mole at the heart of the CIA, and it's up to Artemis Proctor, McCloskey's unforgettable heroine, to track down that mole. We've got some brilliant guests coming up too, including Claire Hubbard Hall on Women in Intelligence and top US thriller writer Joseph Finder. So follow us, tell your friends, subscribe, help us to keep bringing you all the best spy writers. But right now, I'll hand you over to me, talking to David McCloskey about The Seventh Floor. David, thank you so much for coming on the Spy Masters podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me back. Really thrilled to be back.
You are our first returning guest, which is very exciting.
Well, thank you for having me back. I'm really, really thrilled.
So we're here to talk about your latest book, your third, The Seventh Floor, which is fantastic. I have to say, I think it might be my favourite.
Okay, that's good. I appreciate that. I think it is my favorite too. So we're aligned in that.
Fabulous. Okay, well, look, why don't you just sort of lay out the premise and the beginnings of the plot for listeners who haven't read it yet? Those lucky beasts.
So The Seventh Floor is really, I guess, a modern mole hunt. It is a story about, what if the Russians had a very well-placed asset or agent working for them in the upper reaches of Langley on the seventh floor, which is the executive suite where the director has his or her offices. And the book follows, and if you've read my other two books, you'll be familiar with the character Artemis Proctor, who's this kind of wonderfully deranged and colorful CIA case officer. She plays the role of sort of unofficial mole hunter in this story and quickly discovers that her short list of suspects leads to kind of her, I guess you'd say, her closest friends and her most cherished enemies, people she loves to hate. She has to investigate all these people to determine who's actually working for Moscow. And it's, of course, like Moscow X, I really try to set the book in the present-day context of the spy war between the West and Russia. But I think at a deeper level, it's also a story about really a group of friends and different kinds of friendship and what it means to really be able to know the people around you, or frankly, what we oftentimes can't know about the people around us.
Right. There's so much to unpick. So it starts with Sam Joseph, who's a returning character from your first book, Damascus Station. And he starts a casino spending the CIA's money. Now, I wanted to ask you, obviously, one of the things that everybody is fascinated by is the fact that you were in the CIA. So we feel like we can ask you a lot searching questions about where fact meets reality. Is it actually a thing, do we think, that CIA money has been spanked away in casinos of the world in the pursuit of secrets?
The answer to that is undoubtedly, yes. I think that it probably happens with less frequency than it does in my fiction, because Sam now, of course, this is, he was in Damascus Station. He's now back in this one. He has a past as a, sort of semi-professional poker player. And so he's very familiar with casinos. If you've read those two books, you might have come away with a view of the CIA as being, very keen to spend money at the tables. And I think that's absolutely not the case. And in fact, in this book, he kind of jokes about needing all the paperwork and the receipts, and he needs to be able to justify what he did, back to the finance people at Langley, which is really more how it goes. But that said, if there was a plausible, operational reason to be gambling, sure, it would make all the sense in the world to do that. Now, there would be, as he experiences, I think more, you'd be on a bit of a leash, and you would have to justify everything you did back to, kind of the bean counters at Langley. So, bit of a double-edged sword. You kind of don't get the James Bond experience of Felix Leiter shoving you a bunch of cash from the CIA and, getting bailed out that way and not having to expense it. It's all very sort of, there's paperwork behind it. But again, if there's operational reason, absolutely.
Fabulous. Okay, so Sam is in the casino with one mind on the table and the other mind on the expense form that he's going to have to fill in.
Exactly.
Right.
How terrible. I know.
Yeah. And he has a meeting with the Russians, which ends badly for him. Now, one of the things that people love about your books, I think, is that you can kind of flip between a tone that's very light and also some writing that's really quite disturbing. And Sam ends up in Russian custody, solitary confinement, with people trying to kind of get information out of him. And it is actually quite difficult to read. It's really quite brutal stuff. Can you just talk me a little bit about the writing of that?
Yeah. So, I guess now in all the books, I don't know, we'll plumb the depths of the author's psychology on this later, but there has been, scenes of interrogation and in some cases outright torture. I think, with your characters, God bless them, you're always trying to figure out how to put them in more jeopardy. Really. I mean, it's a bit sick, but it kind of is, as a writer, I'm thinking all the time, how do I make as much of this about life and death as possible? And I think a scene like that and I wrote it in kind of almost fragments because I wanted it to feel unsettling and I wanted it to feel like you couldn't quite get your grounding or a moment of breath, in spots in the book. And frankly, I wanted to show right away what Proctor and Sam are up against. I think you write a book about a mole hunt, and because actual mole hunts, actual counter-espionage work is quite tedious and oftentimes quite boring and kind of a desk job in many ways, I think there's a tendency in these sorts of books to make it very procedural, and I wanted to show kind of, if you stand up from the desk and actually look at the opponent that you're up against, what are they like? And so that those scenes kind of, I think, got a little bit harder and more brutal as I revised and as I thought about how sort of the emotional kind of tenor that I wanted to set, it came out. And I think, there are elements of that are very true to the way the Russians would interrogate somebody. But this author definitely took some creative license to make it, as hard on Sam as possible.
Yeah, poor Sam really gets put through the...
Yeah, you feel bad for your characters at the end, but, nothing to be done.
So the fact of his apprehension by the Russians, his arrest by the Russians, is one of the things that leads Artemis to this belief that there is potentially a mole within the CIA, but she's facing her own demons because it's not a spoiler, I think, because it happens pretty early in the book, but Artemis finds herself on the outside.
Yes.
So she has an enemy who appears in a high up place. Just talk to us a little bit about the horrifying. She reminded me a little bit. I don't know, David. I don't know if your children are old enough to have been immersed in Harry Potter in quite the same way I've been. I've been sledgehammered by it for years. But she reminds me a little bit of Dolores Umbridge.
Okay. That's a good. You were interestingly, I'm also being sledgehammered by it by my children now, who are asking me to read these books. And we've just recently, I don't know if it's the fourth or the fifth book where Umbridge makes her first appearance. We've just read it within the past 4 or 5 months, and you're the first person to make that comparison. But I think that's spot on.
Absolutely. So tell us about Debs. Tell us.
Right.
The awful Debs.
The awful Debs. Yeah. So, I wanted Proctor really structurally. You're sort of faced when you do one of these stories, you're faced with a decision of, is this going to happen inside the construct of the official CIA, or is it going to happen outside? And unsurprisingly, it's more fun for it to happen outside. You can do more stuff, get away with more, interesting kind of sequences of tradecraft or Jeopardy or otherwise if it's happening outside. So I wanted it to happen outside, which means that Proctor has to get, canned in some way. Or you have to go with the construct that Le Carré did in Tinker Tailor, where the book opens and Smiley's already out, when it starts. And I thought, Proctor is almost too fun of a character for us to not see how she gets fired, because we all know that that's going to happen in some ridiculously colorful way. And so when I thought about the sort of person who's going to be kind of standing in opposition to her, I thought, well, it has to be some equally sort of horrendous, person who's going to be pushing Proctor out and doing it in a way that, sort of gives her Debs, who's the deputy director for operations when the book opens. So one of the most powerful people at CIA. She's got to have, she's got to be enjoying it too. And so her character, I think, really sprung in many ways in opposition to Proctor, and the little, I guess, bits of her personality, the way she dresses, the way she speaks, her kind of deep past with Proctor, all spun out of just writing these scenes where I found it was actually quite fun to write two characters who really, really hate each other and who kind of love to hate each other at the same time. And so Debs really came out of that. But the Umbridge thing is spot on, because Debs is kind of this, absolute bugaboo for Artemis Proctor throughout the entire novel.
There are two scenes in which they both feature that I particularly enjoyed. One is obviously the one in which Artemis is ousted from the CIA, which I am not going to repeat any of, because anybody who hasn't read it, you need to read it for the first time. It's absolutely brilliant. I cannot recommend it highly enough.
It was, so one of the pull quotes that I'm most proud of is that the New York Times did a short review of the novel, and that scene was described as a, quote, disgusting scene. So it could be a disgusting scene -- New York Times will always be able to be attached to this book, which I'm very proud of.
Yeah, well, disgusting in the best possible way, I would argue. And then there's a wonderful kind of confrontation between the two of them in a bar, and I just thought it was just so brilliantly done. It was Artemis is not a very sort of female character in a traditional sense, right? She's but when she's sparring with another sort of slightly more feminine but really sort of Machiavellian female, there's I felt it was like how women fight. It was very,
thank you,
spiky and sort of a bit bitchy, but an underhand and clever, I thought.
Thank you. Spiky is a good word for their relationship. There isn't a lot up until, and I guess give anything away, but there's not a lot of softness in the relationship between both of them. And, it's fun. It's fun to be able to find characters where that just, as I'm just writing the dialogue, it just kind of comes through,
And then, so Artemis is on the outside, and tell everybody what her job is when she finds herself outside the CIA.
Yeah. This was another kind of bizarre path that Artemis Proctor led me down. So I can't quite pinpoint exactly when in the process. It was quite early. I realized that her job when she left was going to be that she was working at her cousin's alligator-themed amusement park in Central Florida. And she's an alligator wrestler for one of the shows. She's like the person who pins down the gators. And then she does a whole bunch of other kind of, mop up and cleaning work around the park. And I started writing those scenes and had a great deal of fun writing them. and did a lot of research on alligator wrestling as a result, which was also quite fun. And by the way, I grew up part of my childhood in Central Florida. There's an actual place called Gatorland, which was the inspiration for Gatorville in the book. And I was like, for some reason, I just felt like it worked with her character when I thought about her as this very on the edge case officer who's not going to have any kind of normal job. I thought it actually works for her to end up in this like just extremely bizarre situation, because as a CIA officer, that's exactly the kind of positions that she ended up in. And there's a great line in this book where she's basically saying, or actually might even be in Moscow X, she basically says a normal organization would never employ me. And so I just thought, well, I'll find an abnormal organization, and that's exactly the kind of place she'll end up. And it seemed to work. I mean, you'd have to tell me your thoughts on it. I definitely there was some trepidation on my part if it was just too weird, because it's like, it's pretty bonkers to have.
As you say, where else would she end up? What's she going to do? Like work behind the till in the supermarket? She's not.
Exactly. Or like work at a lot of former case officers will do some kind of consulting work, or they'll end up at a think tank in DC, and Proctor she just couldn't be in any of those places. They would never take her to begin with.
I think it's absolutely wonderful. I love it. I love it when she gets arrested. I always want her to stay there for the rest of the book and not get involved. But she does get involved, and there's so effectively it becomes a sort of closed room mystery mole hunt, because she knows early on that it has to be one of a number of CIA agents that she knows brilliantly, including possibly her arch nemesis Debs.
Yes.
And they all know each other from when they were training. And then, as you say, it brings in issues of friendship for her. And she's not a woman necessarily for whom friendship comes very easily. And the way she talks to her friends is absolutely hilarious. It's sort of very banter-based, shall we say. So, I mean, presumably, you mentioned when we first started that you wanted to explore those issues of friendship.
Yeah.
So presumably that was a kind of calculated decision on your part to make the list of possible suspects quite small.
Yeah. Or I think anybody sitting down to write a mole hunt story, and it's probably the same for like cozy mystery too, where there's a body at the beginning and, well, who's the murderer? If you widen the kind of short list of suspects too much, you run the risk of confusing the reader, and also of not allowing for there to be enough space in the story for your investigators, typically your protagonist, to actually spend time with these people, and for you, the reader, to then develop an emotional connection in that character, ideally, in that short list of characters. And so, I wanted to keep it relatively tight, but it also can't be too small. Otherwise, you risk kind of giving away who it is. And in this case, I thought, the reality of like CIA, or just, I think, the espionage business more broadly, is that if you are looking at a group of people who've been in the organization for a long time, and you yourself, the investigator, Proctor, whomever, has also been in, you're looking at people who you have history with. And so I tried to kind of weave the circle of friends as tightly together as possible to show what happens to a group of friends over time, in that, some of them are no longer friends. Some of them are even tighter than they were almost 30 years ago. And, I'm kind of fascinated. And I think one of the interesting things about a lot of really good spy fiction is that it allows you to deal with characters who maybe aren't who they say they are, right? And there's actually a similar parallel to a lot of, like, I guess in the States, we'd call it almost like a domestic conspiracy or domestic thrillers, where you have, a lot of the questions could be like, well, I don't know who my neighbor is. Maybe the neighbor next door who's like an ordinary, lawyer is actually a mass murderer. Or maybe I don't know who my wife or my husband is. Like, there's something really deeply human about thinking someone is one thing and then realizing there's something else. And I felt like with a mole hunt story, you're absolutely offered that is the centerpiece of it, really, is this idea that you could think someone very, very deeply, and then in reality, they've been betraying not just the country, not just the service, but also your friendship over a very long period of time. And, that is kind of, without giving it away, that is Proctor's relationship with the mole. And it sort of sits in contrast to her much more positive, intimate relationships, not romantic, but with someone like Sam, where there's something really intimate and kind of redemptive at the core of their relationship. So I kind of wanted those two things to sit in contrast. And so it kind of became this book about friends, really.
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans. Even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes. Now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox. Clean feels good.
It was a very bizarre reading experience for me, actually, because I was reading your book about a mole hunt while I was reading simultaneously all the newly released MI5 files on the investigations into Anthony Blunt and Kim Philby and John Cancross, because obviously I'm writing a book about those guys, and all the new MI5 files have been released, and the main bulk of what's been released is actually the transcripts of all the interrogations. There's pages and pages and pages, and it makes you pity almost the interrogators and the interrogated, because it's the detail and it's excruciating. It goes on and on and on and on. But it was quite interesting reading a sort of fictional mole hunt while reading a real mole hunt in real time, because it made me sort of think a number of things. One is obviously that fiction allows you to sort of bend and distort in a way that makes things palatable, right?
Yeah.
Because, and as you said earlier, an actual mole hunt is actually very boring and painstaking and takes years. Whereas if you tried to replicate that in fiction, it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I found that's really interesting going through the files is how difficult it is to get any evidence in real life.
Yes.
And was this something you were kind of thinking about? Like, how do you actually, how do you kind of create a plausible mole scenario where there's sort of actual kind of forward momentum and evidence and, the ability to actually kind of finger your man? Because it's hard to do in real life.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And I think that's maybe a reality of it that would be surprising to people who haven't read about actual mole hunts, of the past, because in particular in the States, an investigation like this would be prosecuted by or sort of under the auspices of the Espionage Act, and the way that that's interpreted typically means that you actually need to show specific evidence of treason or intent, like real intent to commit it, and both of those things are very high evidentiary bars. And so what has been the case in the States on a number of occasions has been that these investigations just kind of get abandoned, and you can't actually deal with you can't actually prosecute. And so you have this really high evidentiary bar. And, you think about an intelligence officer, a senior CI officer in the novel who's committing these acts, or in the case of, Philby and Blunt and Karen, you have people who presumably had some training in the trade, right? And in Philby's case, is decades of it. You're concealing your treason is a series of operational acts that in many cases are almost indetectable. Like they're short meetings, or it's communication that is happening in, very sort of short bursts. It can be very hard to find. And I think this is true of Philby, and I try to paint a little bit of this picture in The Seventh Floor. There can also be, I think there's also sort of an instinctive knee-jerk reaction inside spy services sometimes to just try to kind of will it away. Like we don't want to come to terms with the fact that somebody deep in your organization who grew up inside the organization has totally turned against it. And so there can be, I think, a desire to kind of, all those things collide, and there can be a desire sometimes to just, let's just ignore it if we can, and put it to bed.
I think it's the sense, isn't it, that sometimes the steps that would be necessary to uncover it would be as damaging to the organization as the original crime was.
Right.
And so if you're these organizations tend to inculcate, don't they, a kind of sense of belonging and a kind of collegiality. And if if you're worried about the reputation of that organization, then actually exposing the mole has its own risks, right?
That's right. And, the people inside these organizations who are doing the actual counterespionage work are usually not politically popular, let's say. Because, it's like, finding the enemy within is not really the job that most people want, right? And so it can be very challenging for this stuff to kind of resolve in a neat and tidy way. And in fact, in the book, I, without giving too much away, I kind of play around with this a little bit at the end, this idea that, it's very possible or very plausible, even if everybody in the organization knows, to kind of set the traitor adrift in a way and just hope that by putting it to bed, you don't bring, kind of shame on the service, right? The last thing most intelligence officers want is their service in the papers because someone was working for the Russians or someone was working for the Chinese. Like, that's the very last thing. You don't want to be in the papers really at all. And then you don't, for that in particular. And so there's a strong impulse, I think, to kind of look the other way.
You have, so you're the person within the book who represents the kind of the spy catchers within the service is a woman called Petra, who is a fantastic creation. Nobody likes her. She's absolutely bullshit. But I thought she was incredibly realistic because, I've been reading as well about, the mole hunters who are driven slightly mad by it all because it is maddening. I mean, I'm feeling maddened by it and I'm, at a distance of 30 years or whatever it is.
Read all the interrogation reports, of course, driven mad.
You're being driven mad because there's so many things that don't make sense. And you begin to see spies everywhere. You begin to see like circumstantial evidence everywhere you look that everybody is on the take, and it's no wonder that like everybody goes mad.
Yes, and they're a very interesting type of character. I was toying around with how I would, or what sort of person would be our kind of chief mole hunter, the in-house mole hunter. And I started reading, there's a great memoir written by a woman named Jean Vertfoy, who is former CIA. She was the chief of what was called the Special Investigations Unit, SIU, that was doing all of the internal counterespionage work. And they were the ones who kind of eventually got to Aldrich Ames back in the mid-90s. And you listen to interviews with her, you read her book, you look at pictures of her, and you think, like, she kind of has sort of, older church lady vibes in a lot of ways. Like, she had, and she was critically, like, she was a CIA officer who was deeply trusted. Like, I think her husband had been a case officer, and then she kind of eventually gotten a job at CIA too, and had been in for like 30 years. So she was part of the family. And yet she didn't really have a whole lot of political standing, good, bad, or otherwise, because nobody would want, like, this is not the kind of job you take to sort of rise high in the organization. And interestingly enough, I mean, that is kind of the standard template for a lot of counterespionage officers. Is they have tended to be predominantly female. They've tended to be long-standing members of the service in good standing. And they've tended to have a penchant for just absolutely telling it like it is to people, even if it pisses them off. And so I wanted, my Petra character to sort of, imbibe those traits.
She really does. I mean, she's quite ferocious, but, she's banging up against a brick wall as well. Incidentally, just before we carry on, because there's lots more I want to talk about, I just want to ask you one thing. She says in her, she goes on a rant to Artemis Proctor at one point, and she says she doesn't care anymore about the CIA anyway, because it's full of limp dicks managers and woke kids. And I wanted to know, David, is that Petra or is that you? Who's saying that?
No, that's definitely not me, but that is a much more direct and vulgar version of what I do hear sometimes from senior officers who have been out for a while and who look back at the service, oftentimes I think without maybe the most, how would I say it? Oftentimes without justification, but with a feeling of the vibes coming off of the CIA, they'll go on rants like that. And honestly, sometimes this is the great thing about having been inside, is that it is not so hard for me to just get somebody on the phone to kind of, shoot the breeze about CIA. And those kind of quotes are absolute gold when you get one like that. Because you just think, here's somebody who's been in forever. They've got this very strong view about the way the organization's going. Like, can I please, sometimes in these conversations, I'll just stop and say, can I please just make a character say that? And of course, they're usually very happy for me to do that. So that is not David, but that is an older, sort of crustier CIA officer going on their own rant with me on a phone.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I thought it sounds right to me. I'm probably a generation older than you, David. Can we talk as well? I want to talk about the Russian character who's at the centre of this plot, because I think he's fascinating for two reasons. One is obviously he's a fascinating character on himself, but also because I want to talk about his ideological leanings. So first of all, tell us a little bit about Rem, who is on the other side of all of this operation.
Yeah, so Rem Jomov is I would say you're sort of, and I do have some fun with this stereotype a few times, but he is kind of the savvy Russian spy master who is running the mole inside CIA, and therefore trying to protect the mole as Proctor and Sam are sort of investigating and getting closer and closer to the identity of the mole as they go. I wanted Rem to be kind of a picture of a urbane, well-read, Russian who isn't himself a brute or particularly thuggish, but understands at times the necessity for those kind of things. And I wanted him to be somebody who you kind of look at, and obviously he's sitting on top of an organization or close to the top of an organization that will do some pretty nasty things in service of the Russian state. But I didn't want him to be like some kind of crazy cartoon of a Russian villain. I wanted him in many respects, and he's actually, as the book goes on, he's kind of getting closer to retirement himself, and he's kind of put it off because he's a workaholic, and he's eventually going to get run out. I wanted him to be, a Russian bureaucrat in a lot of ways, whose job happens to be protecting the identity of this mole. And, to your point on ideology, I wanted him to be a kind of, muscular Russian nationalist with some, I would almost call it like almost maybe a neo-imperial throwback. I mean, he's got the REM name, which basically means World Revolution in Russian, REM, it's the acronym for it, and was very popular kind of early in the Soviet era. His wife's name is Ninel, which is Lenin backwards, which was also a fun name to have in 1920s and 30s Soviet Union. And so he's a little bit of like a collage of different expressions of Russian nationalism and power over the years. But I think what most comes through in him is that he's absolutely unapologetic and unambivalent about his support for a strong Russia, and believes very strongly that in order for Russia to be strong, the United States has to be weak. And what he's doing in service of that goal by running this mole to try to, turn CIA inside out.
You wrote a fantastic piece in the Times the other day about the kind of resurgence of Moscow's kind of flexing on the kind of world espionage stage and some of the audacious operations that we've seen. And he seemed to me to be kind of indicative of what you were talking about in that. And this idea that in order for Russia to thrive, America must fall. So, sort of for those of us, beyond the Cold War, it feels extraordinary that that's a mindset in Russia. And it feels to me like maybe America occupies more headspace in Russian minds than, Russia does in American minds, really.
Yeah, that's
But you think that that's a reasonable is that a plank of what you see as Putin's nationalism, that it defines itself against the states as much as in its own terms?
Yeah, I think so. I do. And I think it's because structurally, the regime that Putin has built really over the past 25 years has been forced sort of by the essentially sort of vacuum of Russian power that it kind of stepped into in the mid to late 90s. It's sort of been forced to define itself in opposition to structures that the U.S. has either built or supported, in sort of the post-Cold War era. I think, it's almost like a sort of imperialist kind of Russian revanchism that's looking at, sort of the map in a sort of a crude territorial sense. Is sort of looking at the map, and if you look at the map of where Russian power sort of stopped in 1999 when Vladimir Putin takes over, versus 10 years earlier, or versus the lines when the Tsars ruled the place, you've seen what to some degree has been the sort of ahistorical shrinking of Russian sort of power from Moscow. And I think, the way he and the men around him have sort of thought about the system that they've built is, I think, some restoration of Russian power and greatness, which has, for most of the past, sort of 500 years, been expressed by territorial expansion and, subjugating and or dominating the sort of countries around them. And I think we're seeing that happening now with Ukraine and otherwise.
And I suppose because it's a state that is effectively run by ex-secret policemen,
right?
That, their part of their instincts would be, right, what do they know? So if they're pushing themselves beyond Russia's borders in a kind of sort of quasi-imperialistic sense into, as you made the point in your piece in the Times, from coups in Montenegro to poisonings on the streets of London, that's what they know. That's the gameplay they know, right?
That's right. Well, and, whether we're, talking about Britain or America, I think there certainly would be, I think, maybe a more conspiratorial fringe in both countries that would tend to see the secret services, whether that's MI5 or 6 or the CIA, kind of everywhere, behind every corner. And of course, I know that any listeners would assume that a former CIA man is going to say this, but I'm sorry to disappoint everybody. The most effective organs of sort of foreign policy in our two countries are not the secret services, right? I mean, they're not the institutions that are turned to like make political outcomes happen overseas. But in Russia, I made a point in the piece, like, if you look at the way the KGB sort of took over the Soviet state and became one of the most effective, if not the most effective organ of the Soviet state, plus you've got Putin, who came out of that institution, and a lot of the people around him, you do have this very interesting feature of modern Russia where if they want something to happen in the UK or in Montenegro, you turn to your security services, your spy agencies to accomplish that. It is good. I mean, it's good fodder for the spy novelist, but it is sort of a worrisome feature of the landscape today that, there's, I think we're, rising Russia means we see more of its spies and spy services operating overseas.
It occurs to me reading your book and your piece in the Times that one of the parallels between the period that I'm reading about, of the trying to pin down Philby and Blunt, and now, is that if you're a mole and the Russians find you, they don't have any legal constraints. They didn't then. They would just, you'd be dead. And actually, we have all these legal hoops that people kind of take for granted and don't actually pause to think, God, that's incredible, that actually there are legal checks and balances and all. security services. And by and large, with exceptions, they work. And that's actually an incredible thing.
Yeah, we, not without flaws, but we live in open societies that, tend to deal with people as, innocent until presumed guilty, or are just frankly, end up creating or facilitating some of the avenues for these Russian active measures because our societies are open, right? The Russians don't offer the same avenues. And to your point, certainly there's a lot of paperwork if the Russians arrest someone for, espionage, but the outcome is more or less certain what will happen, and up until very recently, that was getting a bullet in the back of the neck. That also means, I think, that we have maybe potentially a larger pool of recruits in some ways in the upper echelons of Russian society, because you have a lot of people who could be sort of ideological defectors in place who don't like the system that they're living in and want to work against it. So, it's a hard, or certainly an overused parallel to say we're in a new Cold War, but there are real similarities with the system that we're dealing with today. And I think the way we dealt with, the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War.
And as you said in that article, what that means is a boon time for spy writers. So, what's the world's loss is our game.
There's a lot of material that is, and, I think I said in the piece that as a human, as a father, as an American, it's all deeply worrisome. As a spy writer, it's good times. So got to balance those out.
As a spy reader, it's certainly good times, and especially when, for any of those amongst my listeners who haven't read The Seventh Floor yet. So, David, thank you so much for coming on Spy Masters. It's been absolutely brilliant talking to you as ever.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow, tweet, spread the word so that we can keep bringing you more brilliant writers talking about spies. Don't miss an episode of the Spy Masters podcast.